thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Welcome. We're not too far apart physically, which is quite funny. Ramsgate to Brighton, but still.
Right. So you're in the UK now, right?
Yeah, I'll be here for the next 2 or 3 months. I've got both the visa reasons not to be in Europe, the Shenzhen visa. I've exhausted my stay, and also I'm working with Carbon Tracker on some work with the finance sector and how they're treating, not properly treating the risk of climate change.
Right. Interesting. I mean, fighting the big fight then.
As
So,
always.
as far as introductions are concerned, there's not much to say that hasn't been said already. Professor Steve Keen is one of the most prominent post-Keynesian economists around, a former professor at Kingston University. So I guess we could get straight into it. And today's topic was supposed to be mainly about energy and theories of value. Um, I think that's a topic that's often something that post-Keynesians have been scared of, really, and they don't really address it that often. They tend to be mostly macro-focused. So something that's personally always bugged me a bit is whenever I'm in my microeconomics classes and lectures, there's not much criticism I can offer because most of the readings I've done on heterodox economics all come from macro. So I think
Yeah.
one of the biggest downsides to the heterodox tradition is this lack of this complete aversion to micro, and I think that's a gap that needs to be filled.
Not so much an aversion to micro, though that is true, but it's an aversion to the theory of value. There, I quite agree with you, and that reflects historic issues and basically a decision that they didn't want to go there. But I think you can go there and get a decent theory of value as a foundation for post-Keynesian economics, and I think it'd be much stronger if it did that.
Right. Yeah, brilliant. So I guess we could go through this in a more historical lens. So I guess the first school of thought in economics that brought a value theory to the table were the physiocrats. So if you could start there, that'll be great.
Well, the Physiocrats, though they had a couple of quite prominent Irish members of them, they were fundamentally based in France. And when you look at France in the 1700s, it was a much more rural economy than the UK and certainly than Scotland, which is where the Industrial Revolution really began. And their perspective, I think, was extremely valid. It was taken from the fact that if you look at an agricultural economy, you can see somebody planting corn, and then out of that comes thousands of ears of corn. And there was, to them, it appeared obvious that the land was the productive resource. And they literally, I think Turgot gave the best expression of it when he said that land absorbs the free gift of nature. Now, in that sense, the free gift of nature is the sun. Okay, energy from the sun, creating growth, and then the farmer harvests that, and then after that you have the distribution of that wealth through the rest of society. But the only source of it is that free gift of nature, quote unquote, and that's quite accurate. That's actually, if you think in terms of modern knowledge of science, after the laws of thermodynamics, the very first law is conservation. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. There's a set amount in the universe, and that's it. And that long predated humans. And what we do is take that energy and matter as well, and transform it into useful energy for us and useful matter for us, as well as necessarily causing waste. So in that sense, I think the Physiocrats were well ahead of their time, and it's a great pity we didn't build on their foundations.
Right. So I guess the more prominent school of thought that sort of replaced them were the classical school,
Yeah.
Adam Smith and David Ricardo. So in regards to their variants of the labor theory of value, could you explain it and its shortcomings?
Well, there's actually quite a fascinating overlap between, I think it was Smith, but I'm trying to think of the author from the Physiocrats, and my mind's going a bit dull at the moment. I've had a bit of a late night last night. It was not Turgot, I'll come to it anyway. But one of the classic texts in the Physiocrats, which predated Smith by a mere 10 years, started off by saying land is the source of all value, and then all the stuff about wealth and superfluities and so on. And when you look at what Smith wrote, he said labour is the source of all value. And it was almost a direct substitution of land in the case of the Physiocrats with labour in the case of Smith. And if you think about it historically, there's interesting reasons for the overlap, and there's interesting reasons for the choice of what they saw as the fundamental source of value. And Smith, of course, as a tutor, took a young royal through a tour through France and specifically sought out Quenet, and I think he may have met other members of the Physiocrats as well. So he had that overlap, and he'd obviously read the Physiocrats too. But if you're in Scotland, the last thing you think is the source of value, pardon me, is the land. Okay, due to the time Smith wrote it was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, coal-based industry, water mills, etc., etc. And he couldn't see the land connection. What he could see was the growth of the division of labour and large manufacturing firms and breaking manufacturing processes down into many steps from the craft days. So he simply substituted effectively labour for land. And that was, I actually regard that as the biggest mistake in the history of economics, because that led to the wars over the theory of value between the classicals and the neoclassicals, and completely pushed energy into the background. It was ignored, and still not incorporated in economics in a strict sense until I actually managed to do it myself in 2017 or thereabouts. But energy has never been properly included in theories of production, which means, of course, from a theoretical point of view, from the point of view of physics and the laws of thermodynamics, it's completely wrong to have a model of production, the theory of value, that leaves out energy.
Right. Yeah. So in regard, if I had to steelman the labor theory of value that Smith and Ricardo presented, it's that all value comes from labor and none of it comes from capital.
It's not that, no. If it's, when you read Smith and Ricardo, and I read them in great detail when I did my master's thesis about 30-something years ago, they are not, they basically, you can dispute whether they're using labor as the measure of value or the source of value. And like Smith at one point would say that when you, in the rude state of human civilization before capitalism, effectively, you said things would exchange in proportion to the amount of labor involved in them. So if it took twice as much labor to catch a beaver as it did to kill a deer, then a beaver would be worth 2 deer in that sort of valuation. Then he said once you have you use machinery involved, so you've got bows and arrows and traps and stuff like that, something must be given for the capital. Very vague. And Marx ridiculed that at various points. And then Ricardo came along, was more strict about saying, well, what do you give for the spear or the trap or the bow and arrow is the amount of labor that goes into making the spear or the trap or the bow and arrow. And finally, Marx came along, and Marx was definitive and said that labor was the only source of value. And then he reduced the machinery as well to the amount of labor that it took to make the machine. So you began from a measurement. You had the physiocrats who were correct about a source of value, but wrong about the possibility for manufacturing to create that value, because they didn't realize, coming from a very agricultural economy, that what you were doing when you were burning coal and peat was actually burning old vegetable matter, which meant you're building the old gift of the sun. You know, it's everything we were using at that stage was solar energy in one form or another, either immediate or preserved in fossil fuels. They weren't aware of that, so they talked about machinery being unproductive. They actually described the manufacturing sector as sterile. Whereas Smith had to explain why wealth came out of manufacturing. His explanation was labour and the division of labour. And then you had Ricardo being more precise about it, saying that everything is measured in terms of the labour, including the capital. And then Marx finally coming along and saying that labour is the only source of value, using a theory initially was based on exclusion, saying that labour has a unique characteristic that no other commodity has. And then after rereading Hegel in 1857, developing a dialectical philosophy-based positive explanation for why labour was the only source of value, but making a mistake. He was actually wrong in his own philosophy. When you applied his philosophy correctly, you argue that all inputs to production can be sources of value.
Yeah, no, it's you've already mentioned Marx, one of the probably the most important classical economist, and definitely one of the most important influential people in history, and how he got wrong the labor theory of value by not introducing the idea of capital, that actually you get value from capital, and therefore he got wrong the prediction of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, that it never happened because it was based on that point. Could you expand a bit more on that, about what Marx got wrong, whether at some point he realized, or he could have, we could like say hypothetically that he may have realized about some of the mistakes, although maybe not really like developing that much more, and also the idea of the transformation problem, which is also like related with all this.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting pretty deep here, so I'll take a bit of a backtrack. But if you, my master's thesis, which I've published 2 papers out of in the Journal of the History of Economic Thought in 1993, but I've never actually published the full thesis. And I just recently put that up on my Patreon website. So if anybody wants to get the full detailed explanation, they can take a look on that page on my Patreon page. But what Marx began with, of course, was a philosopher. He had a PhD in philosophy, was a journalist for a while, got evicted from Prussia, and then while in France, he started reading The Economist because he regarded the economics as the dominant, philosophy didn't dominate, economics did, so he had to learn economics. And as he read the classical economists, starting with Smith, but actually going right back to Petty and beyond, and then forward to his own time, he was initially very negative about the labour theory of value, but then finally in reading Ricardo, he regarded Ricardo as having worked out the essence of labour, or essence of production. And he then took labour's, the measure of value that Ricardo did. So the amount you paid for a chair was the amount of socially necessary labour time that went into its manufacture. And everything exchanged on the basis of the amount of labour time it took to make something. So the question was, if everything exchanges at its value, how do you make a profit? And Marx's explanation was to say that labour is the unique commodity, which there's a difference between commodity and commodity power. So if you buy, an orange, you get orange, and the orange doesn't want to get eaten, that's its problem, okay? It's going to get eaten. So there's no distinction between the commodity and the content of the commodity. Whereas in labour, you can buy labour power, you can buy the capacity to do work, but you can't buy the worker themselves. Slavery is illegal. So that was Marx said, when you buy something, you pay its cost of production. Its cost of production in the case of labour is the means of subsistence. What you then get is labour power, the capacity to work, and that capacity to work can exceed the length of time needed to produce the means of subsistence. That was Marx's initial explanation. So he'd say it might take 6 hours to make the subsistence goods that are necessary to keep a worker alive for a day, and therefore that is the value of labour, which is what you pay when you hire a worker. But what you get is labour power, and that labour can work for 12 hours a day, and the next 6 hours are the source of surplus value. That was Marx's original explanation. And then what that meant as well was that profit, therefore, is proportional to labour. But he argued there was a strong tendency for capitalists in competing with each other to use machinery, couldn't quite explain why, but to use machinery to get an advantage over each other. So there was the tendency of what he called the organic composition of capital to rise. So more fixed capital, less labour in proportion over time, which is empirically an obvious trend. There is more machinery involved in production now than there was 200 years ago. But he said that therefore meant the rate of profit would fall. That was a major source of his explanation for the declining rate of profit. Then in 1857, by sheer chance, he reread Hegel's philosophy of right, and you can see in the Grundrisse, which is the reference you must read if you want to understand how Marx developed these ideas, with the Grundrisse meaning the rough draft of Capital, when he went back to rereading all the classical authors as a prelude to writing Das Kapital itself. And in reading it, he's now reading by accident Hegel, and he starts to re-talk in philosophical terms. So he's including the concept of dialectic from Hegel, which is not what everybody else learns about thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is unpronounceable and I think a very vague idea coming from another philosopher called Fichte. Instead, he talked about foreground, background, and tension. The basic idea was, I'm getting too long-winded, I might have to stop because I can't see your reactions there. So tell me if you'd like me to stop and discuss for at any point, but I want to now explain how Marx developed a new theory of value which contradicted the labor theory of value. Is that okay? Keep on going?
Yeah, sure.
Please go on.
Okay. So the concept that people have of the dialectic has been, like many things in human knowledge, completely scrambled. When I started reading Marx, I was looking for this thesis, antithesis, synthesis stuff, but all my Marxist friends were sprouting those words all the time, and I could not find anything in Marx that was comparable. But what I could find, particularly when I first read Capital, was the idea of foreground and background aspects. And then I read Capital in 1973, I think. And then I went back to do my master's thesis in 1990. I read everything Marx wrote from 1844 through to 1897, including the stuff published posthumously, in chronological order by writing date, more so than by publication. And in the Grundrisse, this is the passage where he starts to think in Hegelian terms. And what he talks about is foreground and background and tension. And the idea that I realized that the way that Marx's logic worked was that any entity is embedded in a society. And that society will focus upon one aspect of that entity, but the entity itself kind of goes without its other aspects. So you get the stuff that goes into the foreground and the other stuff that goes into the background. And there's a tension between the two. So in the case of capitalism, he said the most essential entity in a capitalist economy is the commodity. And said in capitalism, what capitalists focus upon is the exchange value of the commodity. They're not interested in what it does. They want interested in making a profit out of it. So the exchange value becomes the dominant aspect. Use value goes into the background, but therefore there's a tension between the two, which can transform society and the entity over time. So in applying that to labour, he said, well, the exchange value of labour is the cost of production of labour, which is the subsistence wage. The use value of labour is the capacity to do work for the capitalist in a factory. And he said they two become, he literally used the word, the phrase, incommensurable quantities. So his vision of the use value of labour was quantitative. And in general, the exchange value and the use value of a commodity were incommensurable because one is quantitative, the other is qualitative. What he was saying in the case of production is that the use value itself is quantitative because capitalists couldn't care about how comfortable the chair is, it's how many chairs he can sell that matters to him. So the use value and the exchange value in production become both quantitative. And if they're incommensurable, there can be a difference between the two. So the use value of labour is why a capitalist hires a worker. Exchange value is what he pays to buy that worker. There'll be a gap between the two. That's a source of surplus value. But precisely the same argument applies to any other inputs to production. So Marx went from a labour versus labour power, which was a distinction that applied to labour and no other input to production, to use value and exchange value and incommensurability between the two, which applies to all inputs to production. He tried to get the result that they had the same outcome, and all his verbiage, and that's what I think it is, just verbiage, managed to convince most Marxists of that situation. But fundamentally, if you look at the logic, you look at how Marx applied it, he actually derived the result that all inputs to production could produce a surplus.
Right, so if I had to summarize that, the exchange value of capital equipment would be the price you pay to obtain it, whereas the use value would be the revenue flows it gives you over time.
Yep.
And
the different. Yeah. And so what Marx did in the Capital is he realized that this is if you go to the Grundrisse, and I highly recommend reading that book in its entirety, but there's a remarkable footnote that in the Penguin edition appears on page 266 to 267, I think it is, or 67 to 68. And it's 1.5 page long footnote. And in that footnote, Marx first makes the realization about the role of use value and exchange value in analysing capitalism. So everything he'd done beforehand was talking about exchange value and treating use value as trivial. But in thinking in Hegelian terms, he said, well, use value, exchange value, are we talking foreground and background and foreground of an entity, the commodity? Yes, we are. So use value plays a role in capitalism, and that completely transformed how we thought. And he goes at great length in this particular footnote to talk about the ways in which it changed how he thought about capitalism, and therefore how he would think about it in the future. But when he applied it to a machine, he said it also has to be considered that the contribution to the machine exceeds its exchange value, that its contribution is greater than its depreciation. And that's the whole gap analysis. Now that's correct. He applied it correctly. But then you could almost see, and I can almost feel it, Marx going, oh my God, if this is correct, then what happens to the tendency for the rate of profit to fall? Okay. And he then said, oh, well, the essence of all commodities are they're products of labor. Whew, managed to find a way out. So I can still conclude that labor is the source of value. And then he just continued, frankly, bullshitting himself and bullshitting Marxists who read him after that, to try to argue that the only, even with this general analysis, the only commodity which could produce a surplus was labor. And in Das Kapital, he says a point, if a machine costs £150 to make, or so many hours of labor, no matter how much work it does, it can only add 150 to production. Now, when you put that in the use value exchange value analysis, it's saying that the exchange value of a machine is precisely equal to its use value, which contradicts the idea that they're incommensurable.
Right. Yeah. So, for instance, like, I feel that many of the controversies that happened in the early 20th century, like within the socialist movement, the ones that were more like orthodox and wanted to stick with Marx's predictions and to actually like end capitalism through a revolution were more like the Leninist side.
Yeah, very much
But
so. Yeah,
they did realize that capitalism would not collapse naturally. And they explained it through imperialism. So they thought that there had to be a violent uprising to abolish capitalism, whereas I feel that Marx didn't see it necessarily as a violent uprising, but more as a thing that, like a mechanical process, that at some point capitalism would fall naturally, and at that point there would be some like revolution to build something new upon it.
Yeah, if you read, yeah, that's correct. If you read the Communist Manifesto, it's fundamentally a social democratic document about the need for more worker rights, education, etc., etc. It's a very social democratic document. Whereas the Leninist stuff is revolution now and jump over the whole capitalist phase.
I was actually quite surprised. I saw a 10-point policy program, and none of it was actually centralized the entire economy. It was just free education,
nationalizing key industries,
right? Yeah, so that was actually quite surprising.
Yeah,
I want to go into the transformation problem, which has often been levied against the labor theory of value, and Marx's response to it, and then Ian Steedman's response to it, a Sraffian economist. So if you could summarize that briefly.
Okay. Well, the transformation problem comes out of the issue that Marx had a value theory of where surplus came from, and then had to convert that across to a price theory. So you had relative value versus relative price. And because Marx argued that all profit came from labor, then the only, he managed to find one arbitrary example where the value calculation was the same as the price calculation. But if you argue that value comes only from labor, but at the same time, the rate of profit is uniform across all industry sectors, and they all have varying rates of ratios of labor to capital, then you have a transformation issue, which is insoluble. And that's wasted about 150 years at the time of Marxists. And what Stephen does in Marx after Schraffer was simply apply the Schraffian input-output analysis to show that none of those transformations that Marx had argued would work. And you can do without the whole value foundation that Marx started from. You can just work in terms of prices and input-output relationships. And that is all strictly true. The thing is that what people were taking as Marx's value foundations were the erroneous basis for the labor theory of value. So when I started doing my thesis, is back when I was the old person for doing I went back to university quite late to do my master's and PhD. So I began my master's when I was 37, I think, and published a paper when I was 40. And I remember a leading Marxist in Australia, Bruce McFarlane, asking me in the staff room at the economics department at the time, when I said I'm doing a thesis on Marx's theory of value, you mean the transformation problem? I said, no. You got quite a surprise, because everybody's trying to solve the transformation problem. To me, it was what Steedman called a chimera, a non-problem. It came out of the bad logical foundation. But with that argument, Steedman said we should just forget about all the value stuff and just work from input-output mathematics. And my point was, no, we get the theory of value right, which is this dialectical theory of value that says all inputs can be a source of potential profit or surplus, and therefore the transformation problem doesn't exist.
Right. So I guess we can jump from Marx to the next school of thought that kind of was created in response to him, marginalism. Can you explain how they interpret value theory and the problems with it, especially the problems levied at it during the Cambridge Capital controversies?
You guys are getting quite deep here, aren't you? I was expecting a conversation for a podcast, a standard podcast audience. But anyway, okay. If you look at how the classical school came about, as much as I'm critical of them for bringing in, rejecting what the physiocrats had, they fundamentally argued that things exchange at their cost of production, and they said the subjective valuation somebody puts on something is largely irrelevant. So if you had to think about it as modern people do, and they get it wrong, but let's use the modern framework. The modern framework has got supply and demand intersecting, bang, and you've got your equilibrium price. The classicals was that supply and demand are like this, and the demand changes the quantity, but not the price. The price comes down to ultimately being the cost of production. And then what Marx gave, poorly, but this is what was accepted with the working from the unique characteristic of labour, an explanation saying labour is the only source of value. Strictly speaking, he explained the classical attitude that cost of production determines price, but you can still make a profit. And that's because the capitalist is buying all the inputs to production at their exchange value and selling the output at its use value. In a quantitative sense, the use value of the inputs being their capacity to produce goods for production, incommensurability between the two, you'll get a gap, you can make a profit out of that. So that's the overall framework that I come at it from. But what you had, if you look at Smith and Ricardo, particularly Smith was arguing against a feudal society at the time. There was no socialism at the time. There were people who wanted to have a socialist world, but there was no socialist society. So he was fighting against all the strictures of the feudal system. And in that world, the classical school was pro-capitalist and anti-feudal. But then when Marx comes along and you've got all the decline in the standard of workers during the industrial phase, the enclosures and so on, which made the situation of the working class and peasants worse than it was in prior feudal societies. You had, and of course, the pollution was just, I mean, my picture for what Scotland was like in the late 1700s with what Delhi was like in the 1970s. Pollution everywhere, stench, workers sleeping in factories, awful situations like that. So you want a revolution, and that's where the socialist revolutionary began to appear in the early 1810s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. Now, what Marx did was provide a solid foundation for that, based on a logical flaw, but still a very solid foundation. So you got the Internationale, the various movements for socialism, and suddenly the classical school of economics, which Marx was now the master of, which had been pro-capitalist and anti-feudal, that became anti-capitalist and pro-socialism. And so on that point, what was an underground attitude about the theory of value became prominent. So if you go back to the early 1820s, there were still people, particularly in France, Corneau and Jean-Baptiste Say, who argued that utility was an essential part of setting price. So you had Corneau doing the mathematics, which gave us, Corneau, the idea of Corneau equilibrium now, which is still a major element of neoclassical economic theory. But Jean-Baptiste Say saying use value, utility is absolutely essential. And that was minority, it was dismissed by Ricardo, ridiculed by Ricardo, and so on. But once there was still that undergrowth of what we would call neoclassical or utility-oriented economics, where the utility plays a role in setting price. That became dominant in the 1870s. And then you had Bombard work criticising Marx for being logically inconsistent over the transformation problem, which is true, it was. But you then had Volra, Menger, and Jevons all pushing the idea of this utility-based argument, and they were using, effectively mapping across from what they thought was physics at the time, which was, they were working on what, what's his name? Forgetting names is terrible. Philip Mirowski calls energetics, so pre-thermodynamical understanding of physics. Which were very much the physics of mechanics rather than physics of thermodynamics. The neoclassical built their mathematical models around that. So you had a rate of change of something, a rate of change of something else. When the two curves have got the same slope, the gap between them is the maximum, and that's what you're trying to find. That's where the marginal cost and marginal revenue ideas come in. So that approach became dominant in the 1870s. The classical school got effectively kicked out of the universities. It became the background dominated by Marx, obviously, a protest against the mainstream. But the whole neoclassical thing began with an attack on Marx.
Right. And then Sraffa, obviously, and Joan Robinson came in the 1960s to really punk it all. So if you could summarize what the arguments were against marginalism, and especially like marginal productivity theory.
Yeah, well, the main thing is, the main weakness that Marx actually does a wonderful satire on the neoclassical school, even though it was only barely coming into existence when he wrote, because he said the whole idea that utility helps set price is a pre-capitalist attitude. He said you can imagine that two tribes, on the boundary of two tribes, if one can produce something the other tribe can't, then they're willing to pay for the subjective valuation they put on this marvelous object that they can't make, and vice versa. And so the utility plays a role in setting price at the early stage. When you want to buy something, you've got to give away something that you yourself get utility from. And so it said in that situation, the marginal ideas might work. But after a while, each society starts to make that unique commodity for the purposes of sale. They separate production for consumption, for production from trade. And then in that situation, the price falls down to the cost of production. So that was Marx's attack on the idea of the marginal approach. Now, marginalism takes over, and an essential part of the marginal argument is that the rate of return on factors of production reflects their marginal contribution to it. So the wage is the marginal product of labour, and the rate of profit is the marginal product of capital. But to do that, you've got to be able to measure labour and capital in terms that don't depend on their return. So in the case of labour, you measure labour by the number of hours worked. If you work in terms of unskilled labour, number of hours worked per worker. You work in the cost in terms of the wage, dollars per hour. They're independent, so you can work out a wage rate per hour of labour. But when you come to machinery, according to the theory, the price you're willing to pay for the machine depends upon its profitability. The profitability depends upon the price, so you get a circularity. So what Sraffa said is and Robinson was the first to say it, you can't say the amount of capital by the price of capital. You've got to find some other way to measure the amount of capital as independent as the measure for labour is from the wage rate. And Sraffa solved that problem with what he called reduction to dated labour. So you can imagine that a machine, like, I'm using my iPhone here. You can imagine that machine being made out of other machines plus labour one period back. So you then reduce it to the labour that made the machines plus the machines a year ago, and then the labour that made those machines 2 years ago plus the machines, etc., and you keep on going. And you can reduce the machinery component not to zero, but to a much, much smaller component, the rest being the dated labour. And then to work out the rate of return on that, you then have to multiply the wage cost, so by the rate of profit times how many years back you did it. Now what you get is an incredibly non-linear relationship between the rate of profit and how much capital you measure you have. So you can do the independent measurement using the idea of a dated labour reduction of existing machinery, but that gives you such a non-linear relationship that there's no longer such a thing as a defined rate of capital. And the defined amount of capital can be high or low, depending on, with a low or high rate of profit. And I try to explain that in one of the chapters in Debunking Economics, but it's a very nonlinear relationship. So therefore, you can't say that the contribution of machinery reflects the marginal product. It comes down to saying you've got the situation the classical school went into, that profit is a surplus. Profit is a surplus over cost, and it depends on relative bargaining power between workers and capitalists as to how large that surplus is. And Schaffer's logic is incontrovertible. It's just, he wipes out the argument that you can measure the amount of capital. And in fact, Samuelson conceded defeat in that debate in a paper called A Summing Up that he wrote in 1966. But despite that concession, the critics were right, Schaffer was correct, the mainstream is wrong. They still teach this garbage about, the rate of return on capital being the marginal product of capital, and they just ignore criticism, which is the typical way that neoclassicals behave.
Right. He admitted defeat, yet kept on teaching the garbage.
Yeah.
Quite a concerning. It's quite telling about the state of economics.
Yeah.
Quite a religion. So, in terms of Schaffer, looking at capital in terms of dated labor, it does sound a bit quite like the labor theory of value. Did Schaffer believe in it, or?
Oh no. I just actually got to tell my wife I'm doing a podcast right now. Okay. He wants me to send us information, but I've got to wait till after I finish talking to you guys. No, he didn't believe in it. So he was Schaffer was the classic logician. He simply wanted to get a logically sound foundation for economic theory. And he could see all these mythical elements, predominantly, of course, in the neoclassical school. But he was trying to get rid of that and get a solid, well-founded basis for analysing capitalism. So he would be willing to say, like, you could measure, you could use labour as a measure of value, but it's not the source.
Right. So there's a difference, is there?
Yeah. Because he found a way to measure. I mean, I would consider the interesting exercise I'd like to see somebody other than me taken on, because I haven't got time anymore, is you could do a dated energy reduction.
Right.
And that would be probably more sounder again than using dated labour.
Right, I want to get to energy, but before we get to energy, I want to wrap this one up. So the Schaffians have also been known as the Neo-Ricardians. I'm curious as to what aspects of David Ricardo they adopt, and whether what would you think about value theory, just leaving it at a cost of production theory and not going further, like towards energy or something?
Well, like so pardon me interrupting, but come back and we'll come back to what you were going to ask as another elaboration in a moment. But I really think a value theory is essential because what it gives you is a unifying framework for analysing your entire approach to economics. And the one reason the neoclassicals are successful is that their theory of value is seductive. It's the old American humorist put it very well in The Mention when he said to every problem every human problem there's a solution which is neat, plausible, and wrong. And that's what the neoclassical one is like. But it's so neat and plausible that that's what energizes everything they do, and it gives them all a unifying framework for how different neoclassicals analyze different aspects of capitalism. Now, I think we can get a unifying theory of value out of Marx's dialectics. And I think that then gives you a way of building an overall analysis of capitalism, everything from explaining where profit comes from through to how the finance sector behaves, the role of money, in innovation and so on. That can all be done using that dialectical foundation. Without it, you end up being scrounging around and having different models and different foci, and nobody actually communicates with each other all that effectively. And I think that's pretty much the state of post-Keynesian economics, unfortunately, because they haven't tried to build that theory of value. But I think the theory of value, to bring it all together, is essential if you're going to have a genuine paradigm rather than just models that contradict what the neoclassicals say.
So with the idea of using Marx, the dialectics as the foundation, what you mean basically is like trying to analyze both use value and exchange value and how they interact with each other, and trying to have that double approach to value. That's what you're trying to say.
That's what I've done. And when I was in Germany getting the Friedegard Award a couple of weeks ago, since I happened to be by sheer accident in Marx's hometown of Trier, I put together my master's thesis with a paper I've never published called A Marx for Post-Keynesians. And that goes through how you could build a theory of value out of Marx's dialectic, which is completely consistent with post-Keynesian economics. And that's the way that I think. I've never published it. It was just it got rejected by an editor after one positive referee's report. Yeah, one of those weird things that happens in economics, and it never got published, and I haven't pursued it, unfortunately, but it really is how I think about everything that I do in economics comes out of that theory of value.
Right. So yeah, I was going to wrap it up in regards to marginalism. So personally, I'm here to be convinced over to energy theory of value, because at the moment I just kind of adopt the simple cost of production theory that the prices, the relative prices are determined by the cost of production plus the markup, which in turn is determined by bargaining power of the parties involved in labor capital. Now, obviously, going deeper than that in terms of energy, I really want to hear what you have to say about it. And I also just wanted to wrap up Sraffian economics and what aspects of David Ricardo they take, because they're called Neo-Ricardians. So
I found Ricardo tried to solve the same issue. He's saying, how do you value a machine in terms of labour going into it, given the variability of the rate of profit as well? And he actually posed that issue. And in many ways, you can see Sraffa as trying to solve that issue. So Sraffa was the editor of Ricardo's works. So the definitive volumes of Ricardo's writings is edited by Sraffa. So in that sense, the Ricardian to Sraffa link is quite direct.
Yeah, so basically, yeah, like as you've mentioned, the idea of energy, introducing energy to value, that's something that's been really important since the creation of ecological economics, applying thermodynamics to economics and how that affects to everything, basically. So could you please explain a bit, what are the foundations of energy theory of value? What's its current state and how it can solve some of the issues that other theories of value have?
Well, the fundamental point of it actually comes back to saying there is no surplus. Okay? Because if the laws of thermodynamics are, first of all, the conservation of energy and matter. So you can neither create nor destroy energy. And talking in the general terms now, energy being convertible into matter, you can neither create nor destroy it. You simply have the amount in the universe. That's the first law. The second law is that the law of entropy, a tendency for order to decay over time. And the third is that you can only reverse that law if you can find somewhere to dump waste energy, which is at absolute zero, and there's no such place in the universe. So how do you make that vision? No surplus. In fact, waste. So when you use energy to perform useful work, you necessarily generate waste. So how we can make all that consistent with the industrial society we live in, where the amount of goods seem to be rising all the time, and there seems to be a monetary surplus. Well, when nobody's paying the full cost of the stuff which God, very strong inverted commas there, left in the universe. The universe simply had this amount of energy, which we exploit. So we don't pay the cost of it. What you therefore do is when you mine energy, which is what we do, when you mine energy and use that to perform useful work, then you're not paying anything for the input, the genuine cost of the energy. Marx actually discussed this when he talks about Ricardo at one point, trying to put a labor theory of value on the contents of an undeveloped mine. And he actually says, does Ricardo mean here the paying for the minerals for the amount of labour that's gone into them in their undeveloped state? Does it, or does value mean here, as it must do, the prospective exchange value and hypothetical use value of these commodities, of the minerals which haven't yet been taken out of the mine? So you get this free energy. This again back where the Physiocrats are correct. The free energy, that's what we take advantage of. We then generate product which are useful to human society out of that, and then we fight over the distribution of those useful commodities. But to do that, we must also generate waste, again from the second law of thermodynamics. So we have to have an economic which is consistent with the laws of thermodynamics. It doesn't have to use those laws internally. I think that was partly where Joseph Rogan went astray, trying to use the actual laws themselves to explain production and distribution inside economics, but you have to be consistent with them. So we find raw materials and energy in the universe for free. We didn't make them. We then mine them, combine them with energy to make outputs, generate waste necessarily. So we tie up with the impossibility of a waste-free world, whereas the neoclassical, it's intersecting demand and supply curve nonsense effectively talks about this perfect competition where you have no waste. That's bullshit, and that's what really led us so badly astray now. That very idea that that's possible is why we've neglected the damage we do to the environment necessarily by doing production. So all that is just we have to have a foundation which is correct. So we start from we find energy in the universe. We exploit the gap between that and the high level energy sources like fossil fuels or nuclear as well, and the background energy level of the environment as we dump that waste. That's what gives us the capacity to maintain a civilization above the background level of the life forms of other life forms on the planet. But we have to be exploiting the energy to remain there. If we can't exploit the energy, we're going to fall back to being at the same level of wildebeest on the Serengeti. And unfortunately, I think that's what we're going to do, because we totally neglected the role of energy in production for so long that we've developed a theory of economics, neoclassical economics, which leaves out the role of energy completely and therefore is blind to the situation we find ourselves in now, where we're relying upon fossil fuel energy and destroying the sustainability of the ecosphere. And we have to stop that, otherwise the ecosphere will destroy us. And if we stop it, then the energy we're exploiting will collapse, and so will production, so will capitalism.
Right. So I guess one of the problems I've had with looking at energy in terms of a theory of value, there's always like a subjective component that's always present. So the example I think of is, imagine there's a rock that just fell down from space and I happen to find it. Now, no energy was kind of used in me mining it or working to obtain it. I just kind of find it and then I can sell it for a really, really high price because people just subjectively value it that much. And I think even the classical economists made an exception to labor theory of value.
But the very point is, you paid nothing to deliver that rock, okay? And this is it's exactly what the Physiocrats are focusing upon, that we don't make the energy that we exploit to produce output. Now, if you get one single rock, then you're talking about unique commodities which can't be reproduced. And that is actually, Ricardo does a lot of work to say that those whole idea of unique elements, bottles of wine, works of sculpture and art and so on, they can't be used as a valuation for ordinary commodity. You've got to look at things which are produced in the factories, one fork, one fork, one fork. Right. It's, not a case of a gold fork or a fork made by Picasso, which would probably have, that'd be an interesting thought. How would Picasso define a fork? Then you get subjectivity coming into it. So it's reproducibility that's an essential part of the price model that the classical school works with, and we need to be realistic about as well. It's not the one-off works; it's the reproducible ones that matter for a capitalist society. But in that, we only is possible because we are exploiting that free gift. And if your example of a meteor falling onto the planet, and you manage to get a subjective valuation, if that meteor contains stuff which we could make use of, like we're talking chromium, etc., then that valuation is objective on both sides. You pay nothing for it because it falls from the sky. You sell it because it's chromium is part of the production system. Its cost of production is what you get rewarded for.
Right.
Okay. So it can be made consistent without any subjectivity to it.
What if the rock is like completely useless in terms of like?
Then you can't sell it.
A lot of people like useless things, right? I mean.
But use. I mean, status. I mean, and non-fungible tokens, for example, that has to be the ultimate statement of
yeah.
classical knowledge. completely agree. But that's again, you have to be able to explain that stuff at some level. And so if you look at my paper, which I've included in that the Patreon post where I've talked about the Friedegard Award. We'll have to link that in your podcast so people can download the document and take a look at it. But you have to be able to go from objective to subjective at different levels. And Marx does that right from the outset. So he explains with the use value, exchange value dialectic, he explains the source of surplus. It applies to all inputs, but let's get that fixed up. But then he says, what about labour? Now, how do you put labour into that same framework? Well, labour is a commodity and a non-commodity. Okay? The commodity side of labour is somebody who can sell their labour, their time to go and work for somebody and earn a wage, and they get paid a subsistence wage in that situation. But you're also human. You don't like being treated like a machine. You want more than, you want to have a say in what's done in the factory. You want to have your artistic side recognised, etc., etc. So there's a commodity, non-commodity nature to labour. And when you look at how Marx explained it, every time he talked about the wage, every last time, 7 instances, I think, if I remember from my thesis, he used the term, the value of labour, otherwise known as the minimum wage. Okay? So what he normally thought was the wage would be above the value of labour. And the reason for that being that the worker, if a worker only got their means of subsistence, they're being treated as a pure commodity when they're not a pure commodity. So he brought in this subjectivity even at that level. And then he also used subjectivity to try to analyse the value of money. He literally said at one stage, what is the value of money? It can't be the cost of production. So it must be the prospective exchange value, the use value, that determines the value of money. And so you do get this flipping of layers from objective to subjective at various points from that dialectic, which makes that theory much richer than the neoclassical, which is all caught up in subjective, or the classical school, which is all caught up in objective. You must be able to change between those levels.
So what you said before about creating a labor, a theory of value that builds upon the foundations of dialectics, you mean that perspective of use value, exchange value, and also objectivity, subjectivity, and
yeah, and like there are obviously the valuation of non-fungible tokens is subjective, and the poor bloody idiots who bought them are finding out just how real subjectivity is. And money, the valuation you put upon financial assets is all going to be subjective. What are your expectations about the future return, to non-fungible tokens? So expectations play an essential role, and they're necessarily subjective, but they don't work at the level of where the surplus comes from. So you have to be able to flip between the two, and Marx's logic doesn't enable you to do that. But the strict labour theory of value, one extreme, and the neoclassical utility maximisation nonsense at the other, both make it impossible to do that properly.
Yeah, so another important point, you've mentioned before how the lack of energy consideration and waste management in the neoclassical models have brought us to the we've got the yeah, perfect. Yeah, so the whole idea that we're leading towards a climate catastrophe basically due to the not having all these things into consideration. And one of the main solutions by many people, especially at university and many activist groups, is degrowth. And when I first heard about the degrowth movement, I wanted to understand the foundations of it, and I went to read Georgescu Reagan, who was the person who created it. And I guess that my main argument to it is that it's built upon the so-called fourth law of thermodynamics that Georgescu Reagan created, trying to basically extend the idea of entropy of energy to material entropy as well. And that has been debunked by, it's not considered a proper law of thermodynamics, and it's been debunked. And apparently, in his late days, he did realize that he got something wrong. But I had the feeling that probably he didn't want to he didn't want to think basically that most of his works were wrong, in the same way as Marx didn't want to do it, or other people didn't want to do it. So do you think that that's right, that the idea that the growth is built upon a theoretical flaw based on the fourth law of thermodynamics, and that therefore we have to explore something different, more consistent with industrial ecology, which is a field that I think Robert Ayers created and developed. Oh, the idea of a spaceship economy, and yeah, like what's basically your thoughts on that?
Well, largely that we've ignored entropy to our great peril, and wasted all waste in general. So if we're ignoring waste and we're dumping waste into the physical waste and into the environment, we're damaging the capacity of the ecosphere to support the economy. And that's the real flaw that we've done. And if we'd had a thermodynamically sound foundation for economics, which we had back in the 1700s with the Physiocrats, we would have been aware that to produce output we necessarily generate waste. That waste necessarily degrades the environment. If it degrades it sufficiently, then production is impossible. Now, I think we've gone well past the point where we should have realised that, courtesy of neoclassical economists, in particular William Nordhaus, who is totally energy blind and waste blind as well, and has encouraged us to continue producing well past the point where our extraction of resources from the environment and the damage we're doing to the environment through the waste we're pumping in, particularly but not exclusively carbon dioxide, of course. That means we're going to be forced into degrowth whether we want it or not, because we have drastically overshot what we can actually sustainably get out of the ecosphere for the number of humans and the standard of living which we have above the level of animals on the Serengeti. And so we're going to be forced into degrowth. And the question is whether that's degrowth in a organised way or in a disorganised way. And if it's disorganised, then we end up in Mad Max world, and that's what scares me about the future.
So what do you exactly mean about organized degrowth? It's more like selective degrowth, like degrowing the fossil fuel industry, degrowing those type of things, but focusing on more like social care and different type of,
Yeah, I mean, we have an incredibly unequal society, and that inequality has been amplified by neoclassical economics and all the controls it's abolished over distribution of income and distribution of wealth and so on. So if we're going to go backwards, we simply can't rely everybody to really reduce by the same amount. There are people who are already, at starvation levels and saying, well, you've got to eat half as much. They're going to die, and if they want to go die violently, they'll take some of us with them. So you have to say that imposition of degrowth in terms of a reduction of consumption has to fall upon the rich rather than the poor. And the only way to do that effectively, I think, is going to be a rationing system. I think we've so far overshot what is sustainable on the planet that we can no longer use the price system as the means of allocating who gets what when we are forced to reduce the size of the human footprint on the planet. And that would therefore mean rationing as the only way to ensure that everybody, as much as possible, remains alive while we reduce the burden we put on the biosphere.
Okay. I want to extend the insights we got from energy and value theory and apply it more to what the future of heterodox microeconomics could be. Because if you look at micro models nowadays, I want to use an example. Let's say rent control. They use a classical neoclassical, perfect competition model of supply and demand, and they say if you implement rent control, you're going to have a housing shortage, and that's bad. What models could we construct as an alternative to things like that?
Well, I think their models are completely useless. I mean, there's no such model, there's no such thing as perfect competition. It's mathematically ridiculous anyway. And in terms of scale, if you're going to take one extreme, monopoly versus lots and lots of firms, by far the more dominant example, if you're going to simplify and get rid of the stuff that's just a frippery, it's the monopoly end of the spectrum. For example, and you and I are communicating variously using computers. The machines that make the chips, there's one company in, I think it's called ADSL or AMSL in the Netherlands that makes all the machines, one company. So concentration is the rule. And then the question is, how do you get this structure of a concentrated structure of industry? And Schumpeter's work there, I think, is the best foundation. The idea that firms will compete by qualitative variation to get control of a market rather than by price, because price, unless you find a massively cheaper way of doing something, then you are going to be unable to underprice and get the market share you need. You're better off to get hold of people by having a quality variation, and that's where the change in the the quality of the commodities that we consume has come from over time. And you have a power law distribution to explain. I've taken an extreme example of where there's an industry dominated by one firm. But if you look at most industries, like car manufacturing, computer manufacturing, clothing manufacturing, you'll get a power law distribution. A very small number of very large firms that produce most of the output, and a large number of small firms that produce a small amount of the output, but they are driven by the desire to become one of the big firms. So that evolutionary focus, I think that's an extremely important part of how we understand how the capitalism evolves at the micro level. And that's an interesting evolutionary sale. It's got nothing to do with perfect competition or the bullshit that neoclassicals put in their textbooks. And we'd have a much richer economic, if we really saw micro as being about trying to find an evolutionary explanation for the structure of industries and the development of industries over time.
Right. If you have any like links towards alternative models to model these kind of markets, that would be fantastic, because that's the main thing that I've always been seeking, is a coherent alternative to the models that they teach us, because I want my diagrams, and I think
well, there's actually I've got an excellent paper done by a colleague of mine, Paul Ormerod, some years ago, and I'm not sure that's ever been published. It was actually done as a commercial venture, and Paul was given the task by, I think, British Telecom, trying to justify why the neoclassical idea wanted to have as many firms as possible competing in telecommunications. And the point of view that British Telecom was trying to make is, well, a couple of competitors is all we really need. And Paul did a model which involved both price and quality, and an evolutionary model. So you could either come you could have a new firm entering the industry, choosing a price and quality combination, and then see how it competed against the other firms in the industry. And in multiple runs of this system, you look at it in terms of what is good for the consumer. You say, well, okay, the lowest price and the highest quality is the best combination. So he actually defined price and quantities such that 0 was the ideal number to head towards. And so long as you had more than one firm, that's what gave you the combination of high quality and low price. You don't need the competitive stuff, and it was a very good evolutionary model. So I don't think I can find it while we talk here. I'll give it a try, but I've got a feeling I won't be able to locate the paper that quickly. But it was a very good idea of how you can actually model, in an evolutionary sense, the way that competition drives innovation.
Yeah, you could email it afterwards.
Yeah,
that's fine for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, like, you've mentioned the idea of Schumpeter and the idea of innovation. It seems that there's been, like, in the recent years, a new, like, revival of neo-Schumpeterian economics under the whole labor of innovation economics, with people like Mariana Mazzucato, the whole idea of market shaping over market fixing, and how does innovation really works, entrepreneurial state. Do you think that is something like an interesting thing to look at, especially to understand how the micro level actually works?
Yeah, that's the focus we took, to get rid of all this neoclassical perfect competition bullshit and corner oligopoly, yada, yada, yada. And let's get it there and try to explain the structure we actually see in the real world, which is the power distribution at the size of most firms, most industries being dominated by a few very large players, and then a large number of small players, and the process of change over time. That's fascinating. That's what we should be looking at, and neoclassical theory gets in the way.
All right.
Okay.
So I think that covers broadly the topics we wanted to cover today. But I just have a couple personal questions. They're not quite related to value theory, but I just wanted to ask them because I have the opportunity. So I might as well take advantage. So I've been reading about something that Paul Samuelson once came up with. It surprised me because he had the multiplier accelerator model, which kind of showed by mathematical necessity, really, the inherent instability of capitalism. But when I look at post-Keynesian analyses of this, especially with Hyman Minsky, it seems to be more of a psychological phenomenon rather than mathematical, because it's about expectations about the future and then uncertainty. So what I want to know is the business cycle a product of just the multiplier interacting with the accelerator, or is it about animal spirits?
Well, the answer is no to the first one, and sort of yes to the second. But the multiplier accelerator model is a bad model. If you take a look at it, you'll find that the way that you know, that's like if I use the formulation, you'll find in Samuelson, it's y at t plus 2 equals 1 minus s plus c times y at t plus 1 minus c times y at t. And that's with the s as the saving rate and the c is what he called the multiplier component there. That is derived from equating an equation for actual savings to desired investment. Now, there's no theory of economics that says they're the same. Okay, right. It's a logical mistake. When you fix it up, you actually get a third order equation coming out of this thing I wrote back in my master's thesis or my PhD thesis a long, long time ago. I've published it in a couple of places since then. So the multiplier accelerator model is the wrong model. The best foundation in terms of a physical basis for a cyclical economy is Richard Goodwin's work. And Goodwin built a model called a growth cycle, where he got cycles in labour and wages share of GDP and employment rate. And that's your best foundation. That's solidly empirical, nothing to do with expectations. And I've shown you can derive that model strictly from economic definitions. So if you start with the definition of the wages share of GDP and the employment rate, and then include a fundamental simple Phillips curve, you get Goodwin's model. And what I've done is to show you that if you want to include finance in the system, so you include bankers lending money as well, endogenously creating money, and that financing investment, then you get Minsky. So you don't need, the only thing you need to subjectively is that you have a non-linear investment function, or an investment function that doesn't cut through, doesn't mean investments are precisely equal to profit, so you get away from the Gleskian relationship. You will get a cyclical model. So you don't need, crazy expectation elements, simply an argument that capitalists wish to invest more than during booms than they do during slumps, and workers can get better getting wage rises when there's high employment rather than low employment.
Okay, thank you. And maybe one last little query I have. What are your thoughts on interest rate parity theory compared to the more purchasing power parity theory of interest?
Oh, not really. I mean, I need to sit down and if you need to give me the detailed literature for nothing I'm thinking about, put it that way. So interest rates, Marx actually argued that interest rates are totally arbitrary. And I think I agree with him. And certainly the interest rates that the government has to say in bonds do not have anything to do with the interest rate that applies in the secondary market. So the belief that the secondary market should set the rate in the primary market, I think, is a huge mistake.
Right. I mean, my question was more directed towards its effect on exchange rates. Whether, because apparently there's evidence towards covered interest rate parity, in that the futures exchange rate, the forward exchange rate is affected by interest rate policy. Because usually the argument is a monetary policy is so effective that if you want to dampen the economy, you raise interest rates to make sure that demand leaks out of the economy, and that's why it's so effective. So I've always been a skeptic about how useful.
Well, I'm a skeptic, but I haven't worked out my own answer to it, so I won't try answering now.
All right. Well, thank you anyway. It was I really appreciate having you on. It was really brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Your time.
Okay, and I've sent you with the link to the thesis there. I'll see if I can find Paul Ormeron to look for you at a later stage, but I couldn't locate it while we were talking.
Right. We'll just open that and yeah. Have a good day. Happy Halloween.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.